Well, good evening. Thank you very much for coming to the meeting. I'm going to let Harvey introduce our speakers this evening. We're thrilled to have some young people here to talk to us about what's happening in the School of Journalism. I know you have important things to do, like get back to watch the basketball game, etc. So we'll start right now. Thank you for coming.
I was fortunate enough to share dinner with our guests tonight, and we're in for a treat because I really enjoyed myself. So let me introduce Ted Bridas, and I just learned at dinner he's a Miami boy. He graduated from Killian High School down in Miami, and he went to the University of Missouri because at that time, Missouri was the #1 journalism school in the United States. Not anymore. UF and 2 other schools, I think Southern Cal and University of North Carolina are the 3 top journalism schools in the United States of America today. Ted ended up working for the AP, and he was an editor. While he was an editor for the AP, he won the Pulitzer Prize with his Washington investigative team. One of the more interesting things I thought was that he discovered and traced Hillary Clinton's private email server in her basement in New York. And I'm sure he's really friendly with the Clintons, I think, at this point. But he is a professional journalist, a real professional. He's received, besides the Pulitzer Award, he received the 2014 Society of Professional Journalism Ethics, and he's an expert in journalism ethics, First Amendment, investigative journalism, and reporting. And here at UF, he came to UF in 2018, and he teaches advanced reporting, and he heads up Fresh Take Florida, which is University of Florida students writing stories and getting published in things like Miami Herald, all over the United States. They, for instance, broke the story on President Sass and his financial situations running as president of the university. Can I tell him, give him a little leak, tell him that there's a story coming out about Garrett, one of the students, is working on a story right now on how the president's and Musk's task force, how their restriction on funds to universities and biomedical research, how that's going to affect the University of Florida. So these 2 students they're as good journalists as anybody actually working in newspapers right now. At this point, I'm going to turn it over to Ted, and so he can start his presentation.
Thank you very much for having me. My name is Ted Bridas. I am a 3rd-generation Miamian. My father, Ted Bridas Sr., grew up in Miami and worked for the Coast Guard for 33 years down there near the Metro Zoo. And in fact, one of the Coast Guard buildings at the base there is named after him. He was a pretty famous citizen down in Miami because he was a star football player on Miami High's championship team. He went to the Citadel, the military academy, and then went to Vietnam as a young man. And within a year of being in Vietnam, he was, for the Corps of Engineers, he was struck by a mortar. And he lost both legs and his right arm. And the Miami Herald, sort of used him as an illustration of the costs to our local sons in Vietnam. And so the Miami Herald wrote stories about my dad's recovery. And, he was a really remarkable guy. He counseled other veterans and other amputees. He went on to a very successful career as a civil engineer. He stayed athletic. He competed in 2 Paralympic Games for the United States team in wheelchair racing. I saw him race a 50-mile road race in his wheelchair. It took him 7 hours to compete. And so, that's what I'm used to when I grow up and I hear about difficulty and challenges, and I tell my students on week 1, I understand college is hard. I understand life is hard these days, but, that's kind of what I'm used to. So when you come talk to me about the travails in your life, think about, a young 22-year-old with one left arm, having to sustain his family. So I just want to introduce myself a little bit. I was brought on as a faculty member here as a lecturer. So I only have a bachelor's degree. I don't have a PhD, but I had 35 years in journalism, and they said, that's the equivalent of a PhD. And we want you teaching classes, not doing research, not writing academic articles. We want you teaching students how to do the trade of journalism and how it's done properly, how it's done credibly and responsibly and ethically. And so I've so enjoyed my time here at UF. It's a terrific administration. They're very supportive, sometimes more supportive than others. When we're writing about the president and all of the scandals, they're a little less supportive. But for the most part, they really sort of let us do what we're going to do. Our stories are accurate. Our stories are fair. Our stories are ethically told and responsible. And I brought, at Harvey's request, 2 of our top students. And keep in mind, we have 600 students, and every year, I'm privileged to be able to train, some of the top journalism students coming out of one of the top journalism schools in the country. And Vivian and Garrett are definitely some of our all-stars. Vivian will be graduating in just a few months, and Garrett will be graduating down in December. They will undoubtedly have multiple competing job offers to select from, just like a lot of their earlier classmates. Sorry, I'm getting the slide here. Sure. I was one of 1,500 professors hired 6 years ago. This was part of an overall master plan by the legislature and by the governor's office to improve the caliber of Florida's colleges, public colleges and universities, and to raise UF in the rankings, the national rankings, by lowering the class sizes and making sure that we had more faculty to work with students individually. And I'm so privileged and pleased to have been selected for that. When I came on, one of our alumni, Michael Connolly, who of course writes the Bosch books, and you can see the series on Amazon. Connolly is a UF grad and a very generous donor to our program, and writes a check every year, not just to help cover my salary, but also to pay for my students' expenses. So if they need to travel somewhere on a reporting assignment, if we need to buy equipment, an underwater camera, it's no question. So after the hurricanes hit last year, we needed to get students out into the hardest hit fields, so in the hardest hit areas, so that they could interview the impacted people and sort of communicate this, what the level of devastation was to the rest of the state, the readers, viewers, and listeners. And I was able to charter a private helicopter to send the students out. And that's because Michael Connolly decided that it was important that students have these kinds of opportunities. A few years ago, when a hurricane hit the Bahamas, we sent 3 students to the Bahamas with no faculty chaperone, just the 3 of them, into the Bahamas the day after the hurricane hit. They spent a week on the ground reporting, checking in with us continuously. They knew where the embassy was. I had professional reporters who were in the Bahamas who were peers of mine, and they said they would check on them and be okay if anything came up. But one of the students, she had never even been out of the country before. And here she was facing an assignment as a 21-year-old, how to write and how to tell the story and write articles about the destruction and and the rebuilding and the recovery on an island after a hurricane like that. And I have to say, after 5 days, and we chartered a small plane to take them from island to island, so they had a good overall view. And she came back and she was emboldened. I mean, she was so confident in her ability. And the LA Times immediately hired her because the stories that these students produced in the Bahamas were picked up by the Associated Press. They were published in the San Francisco Chronicle and the Chicago Tribune and all over the country, and their bylines were attached to them. So the students got the credit for doing that. And so that's really what Fresh Take Florida is about, this program that we started 6 years ago. They go cover the legislature in Tallahassee, they cover the session, they cover the Supreme Court, they cover circuit courts, they cover federal courts, they go up to Atlanta to the federal courts of appeal, they cover the governor's office, sometimes in ways the governor doesn't appreciate, and that's okay. But the stories are always, scrupulously fair and accurate. And we have an amazing track record. And that's one of the reasons why 100 news organizations in Florida have asked to republish my students' content with their bylines. They don't have to pay for it. The payment is give our students the credit. And when our students come knocking on the door for a job when they graduate, hire them. And we have a very, very good track record of students in the industry here in Florida and also outside the state. Okay. Uh, You're cycling my slides. I'm going to back up a little bit. Okay. So again, after 5 or 6 years now of teaching, my students are everywhere. They're at the Washington Post. Meryl Cornfield covered the presidential race for the Washington Post. She was a UF student just 5 years ago. I have students at the New York Times, the Associated Press, USA Today, CNN, the LA Times, and of course the Miami Herald, the Orlando Sentinel, the Tampa Bay Times, the Sarasota Herald Tribune. We have a network of students across, and they're doing fantastic work. The hiring editors, when they get our students in their newsrooms, they say, "Holy cow, your students are so well prepared." It is though they've had 5 years of experience as a young journalist already. We don't have to train them. We don't have to spend a year, babysitting them and teaching them how to do basic journalism. They come prepared and equipped. And so I have argued to them, that's terrific. You should pay them as a 5-year experienced reporter. So, and I'm happy to say that we've had some success there. So a few years ago, 3-4 years ago, Gannett would offer our students $35,000 a year for a starting job. And I had the Gannett editors come to UF and sit down at the table and said, what could we do to hire more of your students? And I said, well, you could start paying them a decent wage. And now it's 55, just a few years later, because they're worth it. The students are putting in the effort and putting in the worth. So that's been terrific. I was the Society of Professional Journalism's College Journalism Advisor of the Year a couple of years ago, and I founded this Fresh Take Florida program, which we're really, really proud of. And that Fresh Take Florida program is being mimicked now by universities all across the country, where they're sending students to cover their own legislatures. They're writing and reporting on stories that otherwise wouldn't tell. I had 20 years of reporting experience in Washington before I came to UF, including 11 years as editor of AP's investigative team. We won the 2012 Pulitzer for our investigative reporting on the New York City Police Department illegal surveillance of Muslims because they were Muslim, not because they were suspected of crimes. A judge ruled it unconstitutional after our story revealed what was happening. We were the finalist in 2019 for the Pulitzer for Public Service for coverage of how child immigrants were being treated by ICE in some of these facilities. And then my first Pulitzer was at the Wall Street Journal. I watched Flight 77 crash into the Pentagon. I happened to be driving into work that day, and I just was right next to the Pentagon as the plane hit. And I was the first one to call it into the Journal's offices and say, an American jet just crashed into the Pentagon and exploded. And that was for breaking news. I want to talk about, as Harvey mentioned, I was the one that found Clinton's private email server. She was not a fan of that reporting. She refused to acknowledge or deny that she was running an email server out of her basement in Chappaqua for 9 days, until finally the overwhelming pressure from other media asking her about it. She held a news conference at the UN and said, "I did it, and there's nothing illegal about it, and there's nothing wrong with it." My team also led the reporting that sent President Trump's campaign chairman, Paul Manafort, to federal prison for illegal lobbying. And I think that's a good illustration of the fact that we are nonpartisan. We're neutral on this. We report scrupulously on people, whether they're Republicans or Democrats, whether they're conservatives or liberals. We revealed that Al-Qaeda in 2011 had developed a new type of bomb they could smuggle on board airliners, and they were planning on destroying a Western plane. And the FBI was not happy that we discovered the fact that the FBI was investigating this and had actually obtained a copy of the bomb and was analyzing it to try to figure out how to stop the attacks. And so they launched a leaks investigation, and they seized my phone records to try to find who my source was and who the sources were talking to my reporters. So that was a real challenge. And I won 2 National Journalism Ethics Awards, because I think ethics is really at the heart of journalism, and that's something I teach my students. I want to talk just about the state of journalism today. I want to sort of set a foundation, and that's just our agreement that, journalism as our fourth estate, incredibly important. It really is foundational to democracy. Credible, objective journalism is what we're after. It informs and educates our citizens. We counteract misinformation and disinformation, and a real stress for our students that we try to emphasize is our watchdog function of holding powerful institutions accountable, whether it's corporations or government organizations, government agencies, politicians. We're exposing corruption wherever we can, and we're comforting the afflicted. One of my students went down after the hurricanes south of Sarasota, and she had planned this with me. She said, "I want to go into a retirement community that was hit by the hurricane, because the elderly population, they have particular challenges and they have particular stressors now, and they may not have families locally that can be helping them right now. They may have financial issues that others might not have." And I said, that is a terrific idea. And she did, and she wrote a story that the Miami Herald published on the front page. The story went nationally. It was picked up, and readers were emailing her immediately afterwards saying, "I want to send a check to the people that you interviewed, the people who were hurt in this storm, and who are describing the challenges that they have. How can we get money to them?" And she was able to facilitate that. So again, comforting the afflicted is really important. Journalism is a serious business. It is serious like life and death. 6 journalists so far this year have been killed in the line of work, and last year it was 103 worldwide. So we take this very seriously. Who regulates the press? Why doesn't the Trump administration regulate the press? Well, he would love to. Our First Amendment guarantees that the government can't do that. Journalists and news organizations that act unethically, we are exposed by other journalists. We sort of watchdog each other. And here's the story on the slide here. We found out at the AP that the chief foreign correspondent for the Wall Street Journal, where I previously had worked, was on the take, that he was taking money and going into business and doing defense sales with one of his confidential sources, who was a foreign businessman. Totally unethical for him to be doing that. And so we revealed that and went to the Wall Street Journal and said, we're going to publish a story this afternoon exposing what he did, and they fired him immediately. And that's a good example. When the New York Times had the fabulist making up sources, he was exposed by other journalism organizations, and he was fired, as he should be, and he was run out of journalism and never to return. There are also legal remedies for those wronged by reporters. I mean, sometimes we make mistakes, sometimes we're sloppy, sometimes we're careless, and if you're hurt and your reputation is harmed, you can sue in court. And that there's nothing wrong with that. I have no problem with journalists who have made mistakes or have been so reckless, to be dealt with in a courtroom. The risks are plenty, and so the title on today's talk was don't panic, but yeah, there's some real concerns when it comes to journalism and the future that we're going to hand off to Garrett and Vivian here. The economic and the financial woes continue to pile up. I mean, we see the reports of layoffs in major newsrooms. My students have not been affected by layoffs because they are productive. They are early career journalists, so they're very sort of economically efficient for some of these newsrooms. But lots and lots of experienced journalists toward the end of their careers who are making higher salaries, lose their jobs. We have threats to our business models. We hate the fact that Facebook and X and all these other social media platforms can repost our content, or users can repost it without any payment to us and take our intellectual property that we've invested a lot of money and a lot of stakes in producing, and it's just made available freely. And AI is a real serious concern. The artificial intelligence engines are churning over our libraries of work to learn how to write and how to convey content, and we're not getting a dime of that. And that's not okay. So there are lawsuits pending by the big news organizations against some of the AI companies to say, if you're going to use our content that we own, our intellectual property, you need to pay for it. We're seeing lawsuits as litigation weapons. Again, these are people who don't have a viable claim, but they're just running our costs up because they're wealthy. The only time I was ever sued in my 35 years of journalism, was by a Russian oligarch who did business with Paul Manafort, who worked for Trump. He had $5 billion to his name, which was more than the Associated Press was worth in its entirety. And he sued us in federal court because he wanted to know, how did you find out that I hired Manafort to do this? We won in court. The federal judge threw out the case before it even got to discovery. So Oleg Deripaska never got his answer, but he still ended up costing my employer $100,000 in legal fees that we never recovered. And that's just the type of example we're talking about. News organizations that do aggressive reporting, we're vulnerable to these millionaires and billionaires who can come in and just run up our legal costs. And it raises our insurance premiums and things like that. So the return of politically partisan, secretly funded outlets that are appealing to their base. We're competing with these organizations. That's not journalism. If you never read a bad story about the Republicans, or you never read a bad story about the Democrats, it's not journalism. It's just political press, and that's a real competition for us. Our paid readership and viewership is declining, especially among younger generations. You guys have been our base for so long. You're so reliable. Your age groups are so reliable in terms of the media, and we love that. And we wish that the successive generations would pick up your media habits and subscribe to our newspapers and pay for our cable services. And it's not happening, right? They're getting their news off TikTok. And that's a problem, because it's not CBS that's feeding them the news on TikTok. It's some influencer, and we don't know who is driving, who's paying for the influencer. We are at times overwhelmed and outmanned and outmaneuvered by government and industry PR. They're getting very, very good at controlling the narrative, and it's very hard for us to keep up. I covered the Trump administration back in 2016, 2017, and 2018 in Washington before I came to UF. It is exhausting. They're throwing out so many proposals and so many sort of, initiatives that are inflammatory and compelling to write about. And it's hard for a journalism organization to to reasonably and accurately convey what are the consequences, what's factual, because by the time you're ready with that story, they've moved on to 2 or 3 other initiatives. The misinformation on social networks, I was so disappointed to hear that they're going to stop fact checking on Facebook. And now I look at my social media network feeds and I see so many just inarguably wrong posts, right? People are talking about, this senator is, a pedophile, and nobody's knocking it down. We have this credibility gap that's been fueled by self-interested politicians. For years and years now, politicians have said the fake media, you can't trust them, and that has now been instilled in their base, and so they don't pay attention. They don't read our news with any confidence, and they just don't understand that the politicians are doing this for a very self-interested reason, because they don't like the independent fact checking. And then finally, we make mistakes, and there are news organizations that have done some awful reporting, and it's blown up in their face. It's been proven wrong, and so we've got these self-inflicted wounds because it allows the political figures to say, "See, they're biased. That was false. That was false news." And in fact, sometimes we make mistakes. The slide deck says almost 4 in 10 U.S. adults under 30 get their news from influencers. They're not getting it from Walter Cronkite, right? They're getting it from the TikTok guy, and that's a problem. There is some reason for optimism, and the biggest reason for optimism, and I'm going to introduce them because I know you want to hear from them, is Vivian and Garrett and this generation of journalists coming up. They carry the ideals, the appropriate ideals for journalism, for accuracy, for fidelity, integrity. They want to tell factual stories that are impactful. And I feel so good about the future of our industry that's in their hands. But look, the public support for the ideals of journalism remains strong. Local journalism continues to enjoy very good sort of credibility ratings, much more than the national news. We do have incredibly strong constitutional and legal safeguards for now, although those are always at risk, right? The Times v. Sullivan Supreme Court precedent, there's a lot of talk about the Supreme Court may back off the standard that would allow public figures to make it easier to sue organizations. There was an effort last year that was beat back here in Florida to change the defamation laws to make it much easier to sue journalists. And ironically, it was the conservative media outlets who realized, oh gosh, that law would apply to us too. And they went back to the sponsors and said, hey, this is not such a good idea because we're going to get sued too. And they shut it down. We do have new partnerships and new business models. We have angel investors like Bezos and others buying outlets and running them at a loss financially. We have 501c3s, we have charities, we have partnerships, news organizations collaborating and sharing their costs to do reporting, and new business models, ways to make money that don't rely necessarily on advertising. And again, the next generation of journalists are where we can help. How can you help? And here's my appeal. Please continue subscribing to the news. If they're not serving you, complain. By all means, tell the editor how they should do the job better, but please subscribe. It's really important to have them continue to publish news, pay the reporters to get out into the community and act as watchdogs in your interest, as your proxy. Engage in conversations with your social media networks and at dinner and with your family members and others and your friends about trust and appreciation for responsible reporting. Defend the efforts to safeguard journalism protections. If you hear something happening in Tallahassee or in Washington, call your lawmaker and say, hey, this is not okay. The media need to be protected. And consider contributing to institutions that safeguard journalism. And I mentioned the Fresh Take Florida, the foundation fund. Connolly writes a check. We have a number of other donors, and they run the political spectrum. Some are conservative, some are liberal. They love what we're doing because they know that we're doing it right. And the alligator also, and I'll let Garrett talk about this when he comes up, the alligator also accepts contributions. And some of his reporting on Ben Sass generated big checks from some of the readers who really appreciated the fact that they were holding UF and holding institutions accountable for some of the stuff that he's doing. Let me just say a word about Vivian and about Garrett. And I wrote it down because there's so much great stuff to say about them. Vivian is a first-generation college student whose family is from Cuba. She grew up in Hialeah. She's graduating in just a few months. She holds the record for the most published bylines by any undergraduate journalism student in at least a decade. This is how hard she works. She's a joy to teach. She will be working at the Miami Herald this summer. She is the sole recipient of the Society of Professional Journalists Scholarship in Florida. She worked last summer covering state politics for the Raleigh News and Observer in North Carolina. At UF, she has attended reporting programs at the CNN Academy and recently traveled to Dubai. Working in my classes, she was the first to report that US former president actually was pressured to resign by the Board of Trustees, and that the ex-president allowed his senior staff to rack up hundreds of thousands of dollars in travel costs after he allowed them to work remotely. She revealed this bizarre case involving a Messianic Jewish activist who pretended to be Muslim and met undercover over 4 weeks with Muslim professors at UF, including the teacher of the year, in an attempt to goad them into making remarks that would expose their bias against Israel and conservatives. And the way she figured out who he was a sting at a coffee shop in a parking lot where he was confronted with some inconsistent statements, and he got nervous and went and jumped in his car, and we had staged photographers all through the parking lot, and they took pictures of his license plate, which we traced back to actually who he was. So, and that was great. And he was subsequently banned by university police to ever coming back onto campus. She was also first to reveal that hackers broke into the computer network of the Florida Department of Juvenile Justice in Tallahassee, which runs the state's juvenile detention centers and programs to steer troubled kids away from crime. The hacking shut down the digital backbone that the agency used to manage cases statewide for weeks. And she was the one who broke that story as a 22-year-old student. Garrett is a senior from Coral Springs. He will graduate in December. He will be working alongside Vivian at the Miami Herald. This summer. In the fall, he just completed a semester internship in Washington at the Chronicle of Higher Education. Garrett earlier this month earned the award for College Journalist of the Year in the Southeastern United States. He was competing against his peers in Alabama, Arkansas, Florida, Georgia, Kentucky, Louisiana, Mississippi, and Tennessee, and he's #1. He is the university desk editor at the Independent Florida Alligator, one of the largest student papers in the US. He is credited with breaking major developments about the tenure of Ben Sass as the university's president, including disclosures about the president spending millions of dollars in public money on secretive consulting contracts and high-paying positions for his Republican allies. He also revealed other instances of questionable spending by the president's office, including $1.3 million on private catering for lavish dinners, football tailgates, and extravagant social functions, including a $38,000 sushi bar for a holiday party for UF's top brass and officials with the university's fundraising foundation. And that story generated some interest from the Board of Trustees, who was not appreciative of the black eye that was painting for UF. But the university, the president, and the administration here stood strong, defended me, defended the students' work, and the reason they were able to defend it was to say, it's accurate, isn't it? Is it wrong? It's not wrong. So let me just turn this over to Garrett and Vivian. We'll leave time for a Q&A for sure. But I feel very good about turning over the journalism industry to these two.
Hi, everybody. Thank you for coming tonight. I'm excited to talk about the reporting process for these stories with Vivi. Oh, sorry about that. Yeah. Yeah. Okay. Um, Again, thank you guys for having me tonight. I'm excited to talk about this. I'm sure the UF scuttlebutt here has kept you all informed, but for those who aren't with Ben Sass, just to give you a quick rundown, Yale and Harvard grad, became a U.S. Senator in Nebraska, and then in February 2023, became the president here at UF. We had a weird relationship with him at the Alligator. He was kind of dodgy with our request for. Sorry, I'm gripping it pretty tightly, hitting the power button. Anyways, we had a complicated relationship with Sass at the Alligator. He was dodgy with interview. So it was kind of hard to reach him to report on him. And 17 months after he started, he pretty abruptly resigned. And it was a pretty crazy night for me. I remember it was announced at 8:20 p.m., I think. And I remember I was on my couch watching news coverage of the Republican National Convention. I was collaging. I thought it was going to be a very relaxed night. And then I got a call from a source at the university that just said, "Open your email, stay alert. It should come in 3 minutes." And I had an inkling about what it was. I called my managing editors and just say, like, "Get over to my apartment. I need you here." And then 3 minutes later, it came. He had announced that he was resigning. His wife had been diagnosed with epilepsy and was very sick. And he just couldn't balance that, all the duties of being a president for a, flagship university with dealing with his family. So after that, we were kind of looking at follow-up reporting. Vivian had reported that night that the resignation was also kind of came amid this tense, slowly escalating relationship with the Board of Trustees there. So I had been chasing that for a bit, but was having trouble making headway. But one source had indicated that the Board of Trustees had become concerned about his spending. And we had already reported on that there at the Alligator on some of his consulting contracts and some of his hiring practices. So we kind of gathered up everything that we had from previous public records requests, and then sought out to get some new reporting on his kind of top line budget numbers and how those compared to his predecessor, Kent Fox. So we got all those within 2 weeks. I remember I am very meticulous with details, so I think there was a week where I was fact checking that entire article over, just because I wanted to be bulletproof. And I think we had reached out to him on a Wednesday in early August, and then we published the article on a Monday. So, and Sass and some of the other people mentioned in the article didn't get back to us. So it was really a sourceless story, except for a university spokesperson who didn't give us much information. But what we found in our reporting there was that he had, in 1 year, tripled spending compared to Kent Fox's predecessor. And a lot of that was driven by, he really beefed up his leadership team at UF. So he had brought a bunch of former Capitol Hill staffers for him, given them pretty big raises over their Capitol Hill pay, and he let them all, or most of them, work remotely out of state. So, for example, one guy who's making $432,000 was working remotely in DC, and the university would pay for him to periodically fly to campus. And Vivi, I think, can talk about those numbers specifically later and break those down. And he had also spent pretty sizable amount on consultants. There was a $4.7 million contract with McKinsey and Company, pretty prominent consulting firm. SAS actually used to work for them. And during his tenure, the university refused to turn over any documents that would have indicated what they were doing at UF to earn those millions of dollars. And after, I think a month after he resigned, actually, they finally released them, and it was 520 pages of PowerPoint slides. So anyways, so we released that article on Monday, August 12th. And the reaction was pretty instant. I remember, I think Professor Brightus retweeted it, and then the ACLU of Florida did within 5 minutes, and I just turned off my phone because I didn't want to have to deal with that immediately. And then on the Thursday after we published, Jimmy Patronis, the Florida CFO, announced that he wanted an audit. And that finally got SAS to respond to us. So he issued a pretty lengthy defense, which I wish he had given us before we reported, because I would love to have included his voice in that. But at the very top, he said it's not true that there was any inappropriate spending. So we finally got him to talk on something. But yeah, that audit actually came out recently. You can read about that in the Alligator. But I think I'm going to pass it to Vivi to talk about what she did in the wake of all that.
Thank you. Anyways, hi everyone. I'm Vivi. I'm also loud. I'll still use it. Okay, so like my colleague Garrett shared, I mean, essentially the night that SAS resigned, everyone kind of remembers where they were. I was actually in North Carolina. I had just come back from a run after my internship when Ted Brightus called me and let me know. I think it had literally been like a minute after SAS had resigned, and he had informed me. So I worked on doing a quick brief for Fresh Take Florida, and got that out through the Miami Herald and other outlets, and just kind of watched everything unfold. And then I spent the next several weeks of my life really talking to donors and faculty members, more so not off the record, but anonymously, who are willing to share the true behind the scene details about what had happened pertaining to SAS's resignation. Like my colleague mentioned initially, when SAS had resigned, most of what he had cited was that it was due to the fact that his wife was sick, which, just to reiterate, is absolutely true. His wife was sick. But, you know, my job as a journalist is to really lay out the foundation of the full story, and that unfortunately was not the end to it. So that had this article, the SAS Step Down, was about 4 days after Garrett's initial article had been published. Like, Garrett got a couple retweets, and then at some point I turned my phone off because it got a lot of traction. But even then, after I had published that piece that Garrett had contributed to, I think we both still ultimately understood it wasn't necessarily the end of the story. And that's when a series of public records requests that we both had submitted continued, or finally started getting back to us. I was able to report through the Fresh Take Florida distribution list that SAS's hires, which all to my understanding were Republican and had been ex-Senate, and a good chunk of them had been ex-Senate staffers from his time as the Senator of Nebraska in the US Senate, had racked up hundreds and thousands of dollars in travel cost. Not only did they have high paying salaries that ranged, you know, from say 100,000 to 600,000, and they were remote positions, but had also spent thousands of dollars just between travel. So here I kind of put the lead if anyone was in. Did it also turn off? Hello, hello. Does it work? Perfect. Everyone can hear me. Awesome. Anyways, yeah, so this is sort of my lead, just to kind of give people an introduction. But yes, exactly what I put kind of in that lower graph, more than half the over 200,000 itemized expenses attributed to 6 of his senior UF hires working remotely over 17 months was just for airfare or train tickets, plus nearly 50,000 more for hotels. So that was something that, sorry, I can't tell if it's on. That was something that, you know, again, was in the public's best interest to understand and know about, and so we made sure to thoroughly report it. But ultimately, again, that still wasn't the end to it. I'll pass it over to my colleague, but this is just sort of a list laying out some of the expenses for the sushi catering that occurred.
Yeah, so something that I kind of left on the cutting room floor of that initial spending article was that when we were looking at the kind of budget breakdowns for SAS's office and the spending of previous presidents, there had been an uptick in catering. So we weren't able to get a public records request on those itemized catering expenses like Vivi did for travel before we published that first article. And I got it, I think, around August 20th. So at that point, we turn over staff every semester at the Alligator. So I had cycled out. I was headed up to Washington, D.C. for an internship with the Chronicle. And I had already passed off a lot of follow-up stories to the Alligator. And this one was too fun, just peeking at the spreadsheet to pass up. So I messaged Professor Brightus. I asked if he was interested in a story about a $38,000 sushi bar under SAS. And he said, yeah. So I think within 2 weeks, we had kind of worked out how the spreadsheet worked. And I just kind of wanted to show you what we got from that records request to show how something kind of innocuous and boring looking can turn into something really fun. So we highlighted some of the top line expenses there. So we pieced together that there was a $177,000 Christmas party that he had thrown. And that was where the $38,000 sushi bar was. The bill for the liquor alone ended up being $7,000. And, you know, there were other fun itemized catering expenses in there. A lot of them were kind of hard to parse out what they really were for. A lot of them had pretty vague labels like dinner, lunch, and they would cost thousands of dollars. There was one $15,000 charge, and it was just labeled Chris, and we never figured out what that was for. So once we had kind of worked out those numbers, we moved into sourcing. Professor Brightus and I pooled some of our sources together to figure out how many people were at that holiday party, to figure out how much it cost. The estimate that we got at the time was 900 per person. There were about 250 people there. And from there, I was reaching out to people from a catering company that catered most of those expenses, and we found out from somebody that we allowed to speak anonymously to speak freely about you know, one of their company's top clients, about what some of these bigger charges were for. So we noticed in the spreadsheets that there were a lot of tailgate parties, and we knew from our sources that under the previous president there were these skybox tailgates, which SAS maintained, but he also threw these tailgates at the president's mansion. So from the catering company employee, we were able to get headcount estimates there, figure out who was in attendance, and, you know, get those costs per persons again. So there was one tailgate party, I think, that cost $250 per person. And then later that day, there was the second tailgate at the stadium, and I think it cost $30,000. There was peach flavored brisket, caramel macchiato cheesecake, you know, all that good stuff. So once we had all that, we reached out to Sass and James Wegman, he was his former communications director in the Senate, and Sass appointed him to be the vice president for communications at UF. He was the guy who was making $432,000 in Washington, D.C. I think we reached out to him on a Wednesday. We were asking about stuff like, what did we get out of these expenses? Did we end up courting donors with these? How many people were at that holiday party? And they never got back to us. So I remember the fallout from that article. I remember hearing about a very angry call to the university from the Board of Governors who oversee the state university system. And the audit from the state actually recently brought up some of those catering costs. And they found that some of them didn't really pass muster for university policies. The next thing we have here and there's the lead we wrote for the story there. And sorry about that. This is the lead we had for the story here. This ran in Miami Herald, Sun Sentinel, Tampa Bay Times, Florida Politics. And it got a lot of traction. The $38,000 sushi bar really catches people's eyes. I'm going to pass it back to Vivi here about some non-Ben Sass related reporting.
All right, thank you. Also, if we really quickly before I jump about this, if we hadn't reiterated before, but essentially due to Garrett's reporting on the spending spree, it led to an audit, a state audit, which you'll hear more about soon, so stay tuned. And so to kind of just segue a little bit, like my editor Ted Brightus had mentioned, before covering Ben Sass, I worked extensively to report on higher education. So last year when when UF began to have their own college encampments from pro-Palestine protesters, I was essentially the lead reporter for Fresh Take Florida to make sure that I was on scene and following everything day of. So this is an article that we had published just sort of, I believe, the first or second day of those encampments, when the university had finally hit them with a list of new rules, essentially saying you're not allowed to camp or have signs or just sort of, yeah, I mean, it was a huge, ridiculous list that to this day we haven't even really been able to figure out who signed off on because nobody signed it. So I had worked on that, and I had also followed just everyone's cases extensively. Eventually, 9 of those protesters were arrested. I followed their cases, from the day that they were arrested, and I was literally in the crossfire between officers with batons to when they were in court. And I mean, I think all of this to say that it just kind of goes to show the importance of higher education reporting. I mean, this was something that realistically a lot of people within, the legislature didn't necessarily want a lot of coverage on, and then it turned out to be a huge story all across. I mean, I'm sure as most of you saw, there were encampments happening all over the country, all over the state, I mean, even in Canada, etc. But yeah, so that was just a little bit of my background and kind of also the work that I ended up doing when I went on to the News and Observer in North Carolina, which I didn't realize until I was at the NNO. But, for a state as interesting as Florida, we actually have pretty good open public record laws. They don't have that in North Carolina. It was actually it was pretty hard. But yeah, so that's just kind of a little bit about that. And then I don't know if Garrett, you wanted to jump on this, but yeah.
Yeah, so the SAS spending sorry. I'm a very naturally quiet person. But the initial SAS spending story kind of blew up very immediately. It got reprinted in the Miami Herald, I think 1 or 2 days after it had been published, which is very unusual for an alligator story. We're an independent student paper. We don't really have any publishing agreements with anybody else. So I think that was a pretty big deal for us. We got a lot of traction on social media. Ben Sass apparently pays the bills. We got a lot of donations coming in. And then the Poynter Institute, they're a pretty prominent institute dedicated to, educating journalists, promoting free journalism, protecting it. We ended up getting a feature story written about us and kind of the whole process of how that reporting worked. Talked about the experience of, searching for those records, how we wrote the stories, how that looked like, how stressful it was, Vivian's experience, talking to donors, talking to administrators, getting that all done. And I think it was a very rewarding moment for us to kind of be acknowledged for the work that student journalists do, especially at the Alligator. Once again, it's an independent student paper. We're not earning college credits. We're making very little money. And, I think it meant a lot to get that traction, get all those donations. It helps us do our jobs. It helps us pay for public records, which are sometimes very costly. And if any of you are interested in donating, we have Alligator issues out at the front there. You can find our links to our website there, which explains how you can donate. Link to our donation page is alligator.org/page/donate. And yeah, that is kind of how it felt to be recognized for reporting these stories.
Yeah. And then I think at this point we'll just open the floor for any questions that you all might have for us. Yes. And then oh. Okay, perfect. We have two
I'll go.
mics. Perfect.
All right, but since I'm kind of up here, I'm going to ask a question. Harvey actually gave me this article from a few days ago, where Garrett, you were talking about his unnecessary spending, and he's still earning $1 million a year from UF.
Yeah. Yeah.
So have you seen him on campus?
Actually,
All
so he,
Back to the intro. President Fox is very visible. He drives around a golf cart. He takes selfies with the students. The students really love him. Ben Sass, from the day he landed on campus, he basically set himself up in a basement office at the baseball stadium, which is kind of far on the other side of campus. And he would make a run through campus at like 4 a.m. when no students were around. But it was very rare to have a Sass sighting. And in fact, the Alligator, during the first few months of his tenure, kind of poked fun at him and held it like a wanted poster. Like, has anybody seen Ben Sass? Is he on campus? Yes. He was supposed to be teaching one class over in the Hamilton Center for $1 million. The audit revealed he didn't actually teach that class in the fall, and he's probably going to teach it in the next semester, but we're sort of waiting. And Garrett might even enroll in that class.
Okay. All right.
yeah, the audit that came out very recently, the state wasn't convinced that he was doing enough to earn $1 million. Most adjunct professors that teach one course a semester make about $3,500 for that. But yeah, again, I haven't been able to track him down on campus. I've went to his office a couple times and he's not there. I did have one person I knew who was enrolled in the SAS course that he's teaching this semester, co-teaching this semester. Showed up to the first day of it. He dropped it after that. Said he seemed very lively, passionate about teaching it. Came in with a Monster Energy drink. That's about all I know. But yeah, you can read about this in the Alligator today, actually. The university responded to the audit, and they justified the salary by saying that the state has a limit on presidential salaries, that the state can only pay $200,000 of that, and that the rest is paid for in donation money. So they didn't elaborate on what he was doing to earn it, but that was what they had to say.
So
public records requests. It turns out I've done a bunch of them, never with UF, but state agencies, basically. I've been stonewalled a lot. I assume that somebody told you guys what to ask for, and it sounds like you got everything, which suggests to me that maybe somebody wanted to embarrass the university or SAS or both. Or, you know, what's the record of UF responding to public records requests? Because I can tell you state agencies do a horrible job. I know there's stuff that's been hidden from me, or they overcharge or whatever. It sounds like you had pretty good access. So I guess the question is, did somebody tip you off, number one? And number two, do you think there was a motive for that?
I'm gonna actually let all of us like answer this question because I think we'll be able to offer like different perspectives, and Ted will be able to talk to you more about from the state agency. But in terms of at the university level, I mean, it can be kind of hit or miss. You know, as journalists, part of our job too, besides just filing records requests, is to actually like build sources within those record offices. You know, whether that's meeting them for coffee or talking to them. You know, because when you sift through multiple emails and don't have a face to a name, it can sometimes be hard when a request comes in. You know what I mean? In terms of them, you know, delaying, I mean, that definitely has happened. There are records requests that I have requested from the university from when I was doing, you know, coverage on the protests and encampments happening on campus. It's been over a year. I still haven't gotten body cam footage or even records requests. I think just with the nature of how big Garrett's reporting and my reporting became, it was almost like I think the university understood that they had to turn over certain records, if that kind of makes sense. But I think Garrett would probably be able to elaborate.
Yeah, I mean, part of the reporting process is kind of navigating the public record system and how to know what to request. Sometimes it feels like finding a needle in a haystack. So particularly with when you're requesting emails, that's really when you want a source guiding you on what to find. But in the case of the spending article, we had already known that there were probably some increases in staff and consulting costs for the president's office. So I kind of just approached it like testing a hypothesis of how much did this guy spend and how did that stack up to his predecessor. So I didn't I didn't really receive any advising from sources on that. I definitely have in the past for some stories. As for how the university has responded to those requests, I've definitely noticed that they are more responsive after SAS's resignation. Like as an example, throughout the entire course of his tenure, I'd sent in about 3 requests for whatever McKinsey and Company, the consulting firm, was doing at the university, and they would either say no responsive records. I think you had been sending some of those in too. They had either responded to them by saying there were no responsive records or they were shielded under public records laws. And I'd sent in one request for those materials, whatever they had produced under that $4.7 million contract, right after he resigned. And about a month later, they got back to me with the PowerPoints. So there have definitely been some frustrating instances with the Public Records Office where I've had to push back against some redactions. There was one recently where I'd requested emails and they had redacted a big chunk of them because even though these professors were saying, you know, communicating through their public university emails, the records office argued that it wasn't public record because they weren't discussing university business. And I ended up getting the email, and it didn't make the university look good. So there's definitely questions about why certain decisions happen, and I've definitely made that office angry. I've submitted 100 records requests since November 28th, I think. And it's easy for them to get overloaded, but I think Professor Brightus can kind of provide a more broad perspective on this.
So I was brought in as, I was AP's national expert on public records laws and the Freedom of Information Act. And one of the things that I immediately did was reinvigorate our reporting programs for our students on how to use the public records laws to inform their reporting. Because a FLAC, a public relations person, they can choose not to call you back. But under the public records laws, they are required under state law or federal law to respond to your request for records. It's really a demand. It's almost like a subpoena that journalists have or that members of the public have. So we file a lot of public records. We really reinvigorated that process, so much so that about a year into my tenure, I had coffee with the president's office, and he said, "You're filing too many public records requests, and we don't like it." And I said, "Well, that's what you hired me for. So, like pound sand, sorry about that. We're not going to stop." And we're not just filing public records requests with UF. We're filing with the Gainesville Police Department, the Alachua County Sheriff's Office, the state agencies, the FDLE, the executive branch, the legislature in Florida. The legislature is covered under the public records law. And so, we employ these, and we have some techniques. For example, you said you're getting stonewalled. Well, I teach my students, when you feel like you're getting stonewalled, file a secondary request for all the internal communications about your first request. And what you'll see are email threads saying, "We can't turn this over. It's too embarrassing." And they have to turn that over. And so that gives you some confidence that, okay, there's actually some shady business going on, or it's somebody's at the maternity leave and she's the only one who handles records requests. And that's not reasonable, but at least I now understand why things are taking so long. So there are some ways to manipulate kind of the process with best practices.
Any more questions?
I don't have a question. I just have a comment. Excuse me. Living here, most people that live at Oak Hammock are educated or highly educated. And I've talked to a lot of people at lunch or wherever, and you'll mention something that's happened in the news, a big story, like the plane crashes that just happened. And they're like, "Well, I didn't hear about that. I don't know anything about that." And I'm like, "Oh my God, do you never watch the news?" Or, I know newspapers are not as popular now, but it's just amazing to me that people that live here that are uninformed about things they should be informed about, in my opinion.
Well, as a person who still subscribes to the Gainesville Sun, the paper edition, I was very interested when it was the Alligator that broke the story about Ben Sass and not the Gainesville Sun. Congratulations. And one more question?
Two things. I just want to compliment you all on the results that you got. And it sounds to me like you're having the education of a lifetime. And the second thing is, I might have a tip for you for another story about an ICE detention center in McClenny, Florida. I'll give you my card and we'll talk later.
This lady knows everything. Yes, talk to her. Baker Detention Center, right? Okay. Any other questions for our reporters? Behind me. Oh, okay.
Thank you. With the safety concerns for reporters and journalists, does this impact you at all?
Okay, so that's actually a pretty good question. I'm gonna do my best to be concise, but it's definitely a concern. But it's also something that I think you just learn about as you go and figure out. And I say that because I didn't realize that I was, a reporter that would very much so throw myself into a dangerous situation for public service until I was in potentially a situation. Actually, before I did the coverage of the encampments on my college campus, there was a vigil for Israel about 3 days after the initial Hamas attacks. And at that vigil, there were over 1,200 people in attendance. A loud noise went off that was perceived to be gunshots and explosions. I ran for like maybe 30 seconds and then literally lost my flip-flops, my shoes, like was just running barefoot. And then something in me was just kind of like, I should run back, make phone calls, and write about this. So I literally ran back to the scene not knowing what was going on, hid in a bush, and started making phone calls. I discovered that about myself that day. I mean, it's not to say that, you can't necessarily prepare yourself for those situations by going through less. That was just my experience. I think also that at least at the University of Florida, though we don't necessarily have like a hands-on course on conflict reporting and things of that nature, our professors still do a really good job at preparing us for the possibility and letting us know that there might be a time in your career where you could be exposed to a deceased body. There might be a time in your career where you might be covering protests and there's tear gas and rubber bullets, etc. So they do a good job at preparing us in that way. And so like even when I went through that, I was more than prepared, even though I had never been through it. I don't know if anyone else wants to add to that, but that was just my experience, and I hope that kind of helps answer your question.
Yeah, I was going to say I think the most physical danger I've ever been in is probably at covering protests. But even then, I don't think that was as intense for me. But the J School at UF does do a very good job of preparing students for those tense breaking news situations. In the fall of 2023, Vivian and I took a class with Professor Brightus called Breaking News, where every week you learn about how to cover a new breaking news topic, crime briefs, gas leaks, protests, anything like that. And I remember, and I give this advice to my reporters at the Alligator. I have especially lately because, there's concerns that protests are going to ramp up and I want them to be prepared. So, I mean, after I give them all the safety advice I can, passing on, whatever Professor Brightus had taught us in that class, I give them another piece of advice that he gave us the day after that vigil happened. And it was, in those intense breaking news situations, you kind of have to see through the fog of war. It's your duty to be there, cover things as thoroughly as you can, be in the middle of the action, while still keeping those, principles of safety in mind. It's kind of part of the job.
And I'm glad Vivian answered that question, because I do want to say women get bullied, women reporters, women journalists get bullied way more than men online. The social media, the misogyny is awful. One of my former students did a story that was very critical of Governor DeSantis. He had bragged about luring all these New York City Police Department officers to Florida to become cops here in Florida. And we looked into their backgrounds and found out that we weren't getting the cream of the crop. These were guys the NYPD were getting ready to get rid of anyway. And so she wrote a fact story, basically a fact check that said, the governor's doing this for political purposes. What we're actually getting are, the cop that had a civil lawsuit judgment because he beat an innocent man, into a coma, or the guy, the cop that was fired as a Walmart security guard. And poor Eileen was brutalized on social media. She had to shut down her Instagram account. They were commenting on her weight and her complexion and things like that. So there's safety, and then there's also the sort of the mental health awareness. And I'm glad Vivian talked about that vigil where we had the stampede, the literal stampede of students, because we had at the College of Journalism, we had a lot of students there that night. Some of them were out covering it for their television journalism classes, and some were out there covering it for their radio journalism classes, and Vivian was out there covering it for one of my classes. And universally, as soon as it happened, of course, we heard about it, we started doing a head count. So all of the faculty started contacting their students to say, are you okay? Are you in the hospital? Were you hurt? We want to make sure that you're okay, that you don't need help. And so as we're making phone calls to get everybody, what we're hearing is, things happened and I dropped my camera and I ran, and I don't even know, like the camera broke. I don't know where the equipment that I had out there was. And no one thought to come back like Vivian did and call. And her first call was to me to say, Professor Brightus, you wouldn't believe what just happened. And we had a bulletin out for all the news organizations in Florida within 10 minutes of it happening because Vivian had the wherewithal. And really, you can't teach this. This is just instincts. And so she was so courageous and so brave. And yes, she was barefoot because she ran out of her shoes like a lot of students did that night. But she had the sort of the courage to come back to the scene and make sure she was safe, but then immediately to call and start dictating from the scene. And that's what we need our journalists to do. And so I was so proud of her.
Thank you all very much for coming and sharing your experiences with us. We really appreciate, and best of luck to you in the future. Just very quickly, next month, we will have a speaker from the Levin College of Law, and she'll be talking about the Constitution. That should be fun. Okay, and that's second Tuesday, March 11th. We'll see you then.